Hello everybody and welcome back to another week in review, this time of first Polish Piechoty and Fallshirmpanzer Hermann Goring, suggested about a month ago by Nikita Blagorodorov. Remember that if you'd like to see any specific videos, leave them in the comments and I will either route you to where they already exist or I will get it queued up in chronological order. Without further ado though, let's hop right into my first Piakoti deck. So I must admit, ever since the release of the Death on the Vistula campaign that released Poland into the game, I haven't been a huge fan of this deck, and I don't know that much changed throughout the week. While it does have some very interesting units, and it doesn't really fall short in any one category, it does kind of miss out on some things that would make this a very well-rounded division. On top of that, it lacks any sort of super unit that would set it above and beyond in any specific tab, and so it's kind of a middling deck at best, and it's not the best middling deck on the Soviet side, in my opinion. Starting off in the Recon tab, I grabbed a must-do by grabbing these Su-57s in Phase A. They are phase locked to Phase A, and I think I'd bring them in Phase A regardless of that. These guys are fantastic. They have the recon stats so they're able to spot things first. They typically fire first and much faster given their 57mm cannon, and for some reason they're practically invisible. Typically I would send 2 to 4 of these up in my opening and just accompany troops along all the lines, maybe snipe out a few transports here and there, and then back them away to a safe place where I could later use them to snipe out enemy tanks or continue with my harassment of their infantry. Before I go any further, let me just say to any Polish speakers out there, I am perversely sorry for how I'm going to pronounce some of these names, but let's jump right into it. The Zviadkoni, which I was bringing in the Recon tab, were kind of just to supplement my infantry in a weird way. I brought these guys in because they had an MG42 and a fairly decent mid-ranged complement to boot, so I was using these guys to support infantry as well as grabbing that recon stat, but mainly as frontline mid-ranged infantry. In Phase C I continued in this vein and brought in these guys, God forbid I try to pronounce that word, but these guys have a decent mid-range complement in the form of the SVTs, but also bring in a Panzerschreck and can bring in the M2A1 transport, so I just felt like bringing these guys in as sort of close infantry support and as bringing in another M2A1 half-track. Leading us off in the infantry tab, I brought in a card of the Strelki SVT in the Studebaker transport. I brought in a card of the Strelki commanders. These are practically the same as any other Russian division. They include smoke, some SVTs, and typically I just bring them in for the command. 4 per card in Phase A is decent. Then I brought in the Tanko Desantniki in Phase A, as the M2A1 half-track in the infantry tab is limited to 6 per card, so bringing them in Phase A got me all of those, as well as some fairly decent early game forest pushing power in the form of those Tanko Desantniki. Moving on, I brought in the Strelki CKM, which were practically just better versions of the Strelki SVT, however, a bit more pricey to boot. In Phase B, I brought in another card of the Strelki CKM, as well as a card of the Sapori Rocks, which are just a favorite of mine among Russian and Polish infantry, no matter what division they come in. Not only do they feature 2 flamethrowers, but on top of that, they also have a fairly decent mid-range to engage, so they're not going to be left out in the open as a lot of Tanko Desantniki or Automachiki might. Speaking of the Automachiki, I brought those in Phase C, which, they're fine. I mean, I brought them in for that close-ranged engagement, and for the most part, I have gotten much better about using these throughout my time playing these week in review decks. However, I still don't really favor these units in any way. Sure, they do great in that 100-meter engagement, but getting them there is oftentimes more micromanaging than I need to put into it, when I could just, for the price of 2 of them, bring in a T-34 and oftentimes just push the infantry out and have a tank on top of that. But I would be remiss in saying they didn't have their uses. I also finished it out with a card of the Strelki CKM. Now, if you're wondering why I've used the Russian names for all these, it's because they're practically just Russian units with a Polish name stamped on the top, and I can pronounce the Russian words more or less, so it felt like a no-brainer to me. In the tank tab, I brought in a T-34-76 Model 1943 card in Phase A, just to give me the most tanks that I could possibly have, as this deck kind of hurts for tanks. In Phases B and C, I brought in the cards of T-34Es, and these guys were just fantastic medium tanks. I have nothing to criticize about the T-34E except that I couldn't get more of them, and that's really just a balance issue at that point. They are locked to 1-star veterancy, which can be a little annoying, but I found that it oftentimes netted me a few more kills than I would have otherwise gotten. In the support tab, I brought in the Automachiki in Phase A, just to ride their motorbikes in, burn whoever got to the forest first to death, and establish a beachhead more or less for the rest of my troops. Past that, I brought in the 52P 353 support gun. I found I wasn't using this as often as I should have been, and probably would have been better off bringing in the Maxim if I liked the Maxim at all. However, I brought these in and they made it throughout the week in my deck. I used them sparingly, but they did what I needed them to. I also brought in a Phase A Commander and a Phase B card of the supply trucks, which is just fairly standard for me, just to refill ammo, especially on my AA tab later in the deck. In the anti-tank tab, I started off with the PTRS teams, which come in at 9 per card, which is quite decent for their 10-point price tag, and these guys, I just love them to death. I absolutely adore the PTRS teams on the Allied side. I think they're an excellent addition to any deck. And these guys were picking up Stugs, let alone infantry, so it's not like they were bad in any way. Moving on, I brought in a card of the M42 45 mils. These guys were great at harassing enemy transports, harassing enemy light tanks, but aren't going to do any real damage to a heavy tank unless that player is really not micromanaging it. To finish out my Phase A, I brought in a card of the Su-76s just to have something with a 76mm gun on it to take out heavy tanks if I get it into the sneakiest position of all time, but oftentimes these guys were used for infantry suppression more than anything else. In Phase B, I brought in another card of the M42s, as well as a card of the Ziz-3s, because it's the best gun that you can get access to in this game, so I just kinda had to. Finishing it all out, I brought in the Su-85, and this was again just more APCR that I could sneak up on enemy heavy tanks and hopefully get the kill on them. In the anti-air tab, I brought in a card of the M17s in Phase A Phase B card of the 85mm dual-purpose guns, and a Phase C card of the 37mm AA guns. All in all, this is a fairly standard tab, and honestly, I didn't really need anything else from it. I really enjoyed the versatility that the 85 gave me, and if the game went on late, I still had the spam of the 37mm, as it were. On top of that, the M17 has recently grown on me in quite a huge way, in that I've begun using it more and more often. I have to babysit it a lot, keeping it near command, making sure it's in range of enemy aircraft, and making sure it's supplied, but I find that if I do babysit it, it oftentimes pays for itself and then some. In the artillery tab, or in this division as I like to call it, the AT tab part 2, I brought in a card of the M30s in phases A and B, both in the supply trucks and both at 1 star, because I really don't need my M30s to miss under any circumstance. If I'm bringing in an M30, that means that something at least as heavy as a Tiger is bearing me down, and I certainly don't need this thing just whiffing shots into the wind, so 7% accuracy is still 7% accuracy. Past that, I brought in the Phase B card, though I thought about dropping into Phase C before the end of the week, just never got around to it, of the F-22s, just to kind of help me with that late game Ziz-3 game, because these are still 76.2mm, and while they don't have the APCR that the Ziz-3 has, they still are excellent for anti-tank weaponry or suppressing infantry on the way. In the air tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the IL-2M 80-point bombers, a Phase A card of the IL-2M 120-point cluster bomber, a Phase A card of the Yak-3 at 2 stars of disappointment, a Phase B card of the IL-2M cluster bombers, and 2 Phase C cards of the IL-2Ms with just 1,000 bombs. This is typical among my decks, and these Phase C cards of IL-2Ms were mainly for memes. If things got out of hand, if there were 3 elephants staring me down, I would just bomb them all to death and move on, and that was that. Moving on to my deck at the end of the week, not terribly much has changed. However, in the Recon tab, I have picked up another card of the T-34-76 Recon tanks, as I was really hurting for T-34s throughout my Phase A especially. The infantry tab got through the week unscathed, although I will cite a few grievances with the infantry tab. It typically did its job throughout the week, so I can't complain too heavily about it. The biggest complaint that I can levy onto it, however, is my own stupidity at being able to decipher the difference in these units at a glance. Because of the number of times that I've played with Russian units, I can glance up there and basically get the gist of what the unit does. Automachiki, close ranged, Strelky, mid-ranged, so on and so forth. However, with these guys, because the names are slightly different, I found that I was looking up there and staring at them like, what the hell is in this thing? Oh no, it's PPSHs, that's not what I needed. And that sort of thing repeated itself a lot throughout the week. That's not really an indictment on the deck, but if you're looking at playing Poland and you've only ever played Russia on the Allies side, that's going to be a real concern for you, or maybe it was just me. No way to be sure. The tank and support tab got out without a scratch as well, however in the AT tab I dropped the Phase B card of the M42s as I found I was just using these as sort of a spam defense, and I oftentimes had a lot of my Phase A M42s left over at that point. In the artillery tab I dropped the Phase B card of M30s in favor of a Katyusha because I really needed something that could kill enemies that were clumped up or break hardened positions so that I could push into them, and the M30s just weren't doing that for me. Typically I had my M30s in ambush locations along the fronts, and so if I fired them for their actual artillery purpose, then they would be spotted by the tanks that I was trying to ambush, and that wasn't going to be any good for anybody. So I brought these in to sort of supplement that and just became very, very careful of my M30s. My air tab saw no change, however if I was to make a change I would probably drop the AK-3. I think the AK-3 is an excellent idea. I think that having it forced to 2 stars didn't really dissuade me from using it in any way. However, the AK-3 lacks a lot in maneuverability, and I found that that was really killing me. Despite its speed and its excellent armaments, I was flying it in and then struggling to get behind enemy aircraft, oftentimes just letting it die. If I had to choose one overarching argument to really level on this deck as a whole, it would be, for the love of God, give me one bazooka or Panzerschreck. This deck oftentimes finds itself in excellent ambush locations on enemy tanks, however being that it lacks Resvedka or any sort of Panzerschreck team in the anti-tank tab, it doesn't have a way to really deal with that. Your longest ranged anti-tank option among infantry, that is, other than the PTRS, which really can't do anything to heavy tanks, is a Panzerfaust at 120 meters, and tanks are just going to see you and probably get you stunned before you are able to sneak up to that point. Sure, you could use copious amounts of smoke and sneak up on them, but if we're being honest, if the enemy player is even half as good, they're not going to just leave their tanks next to unattended forests without checking what's in them first. 250 meters is still quite close, but it gives you that ambush ability without really pushing front line to let the enemy know that that forest is occupied by something, so it would just really help in this situation. What's more, this deck lacks a lot in staying power. The T-34s make it very easy to push up on front lines, as they relocate very easily, they push enemy infantry great with their 2 DTs on them, and they're pretty good at handling medium tanks at their own weight class. However, they won't box with anything at 2 kilometers, be it a Sherman, another T-34, really just anything. They're just not great boxing tanks, and so you have to get them in close, and that really leads to a lack of ability to hold on to the ground that you've taken. On top of this, your infantry are excellent at taking forests or taking cities, however holding on to those cities is really difficult with the lack of those bazooka teams, or really any way to deal with a light vehicle that rolls up on just outside of range. All that said though, the infantry was probably my least upsetting part of this division. Between the infantry in the infantry tab as well as the ones in the recon tab that I was supplementing it with, I rarely had a problem of the infantry variety that I couldn't solve with these infantry. I also found that a lot of the time I had to use the 85mm dual-purpose gun as an exclusively anti-tank weapon, as otherwise I just wouldn't have been able to deal with things like Panthers or Tigers that were just rolling up on me constantly. If I was to propose a real change to my deck as I've presented it, however, I would probably say drop the Phase B card of the IL-2M cluster bombers and pick up another card of ASF or perhaps another card of bombers. The reason I say this is because you really have to micromanage and babysit to get all the enemy AA dead enough to be able to use these bombers, and so you only ever get one good cluster bombing off before your enemy realizes that they've underinvested in AA. I typically save this for whatever the biggest enemy tank or biggest block of tanks is going to be that I'm going to be running up against. If I'm fighting a King Tiger division, I'll run and kill one King Tiger in Phase A, pray to God that they don't have too many in Phase B, because by then they'll have figured out what they've done wrong and brought in a lot of AA to compensate. Because of that AA, it really makes these IL-2Ms in Phase C kind of worthless. They're certainly not the PE2s, and so they won't resist as much damage before dropping their munitions as I'd like. Because of this, oftentimes you're going to lose about half of your bombing force if you flew all of your planes at the same time, just to that stunning damage right off the bat. I found that this deck was really frustrating, but got less frustrating the fewer enemy players there were in the game. It was also very map dependent. If there were a lot of forest, this deck really excelled. Think Lenina on the forested area in the 4v4 version, or in certain areas on other maps, of course. But this deck really excelled at those and fell completely apart if it was asked to take open ground, hold on to a city, or take a hill. Because of this, it just felt as though it didn't have the answers that I needed while I was playing it, and it was very frustrating for that reason. Honestly, I'm sure there was a way I could have made this division better, however, I just didn't really know what to do throughout the entire week, and I've felt this before when playing with this exact division. I find that each time I try to make this division work, I just run into a brick wall of something that this division just has no way to deal with objectively, and that's that. I kind of just delete it after that. Oddly, I find that this is true of all the Polish divisions currently in the game, as they are just worse versions of better Russian or Allied decks. Of course, I could be wrong on this, and there could be some gigantic meta in the 1v1 community that utilizes this deck to its fullest, and I have no doubt that a better player than I could have built a better deck than this. However, I find that with my current skill level and with my current level of play in the game, I couldn't make this work any better than I currently did. Moving on to Hermann Goring Fallshirmpanzer. Now let me preface this by saying that this is probably my favorite deck in the game. I absolutely adore this deck. It has answers to almost every single problem and so many interesting units to just bring in and use in very unique ways that are specific to this division. Because of this, if new players ask me which division they should play first, I oftentimes say this division, as it just has every answer that you need while relying not too heavily on any one category. With all that said, let's hop right into the Recon tab, of which I have a Phase A card of the SPW-233s to accompany my infantry up as sort of a light vehicle. That's typically what the SPWs are used for, as well as a Phase B card of the HG Spare Troop, which came in the 251 half-track and just were an excellent set of eyes on the front line and could defend themselves if things went a little haywire. In the Infantry tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the HG Ersatztruppen, a Phase A card of the Sturm Pioneer coming in the Horse Transport, a Phase A card of the HG Pioneer MP44, a Phase B card of the HG Panzer Grenadier Führer, a Phase B card of the Valkyrie, a Phase C card of the HG Panzer Grenadier, and a Phase C card of the Valkyrie. Now, I know that looking at this division, it certainly isn't viable for 1v1s. The 40-point HG Pioneer, as I've been pointed out time and again, are not very cost-effective units in that scenario. However, in team games and just in general, I enjoy watching these guys work. It doesn't matter if they're vastly point inefficient and that I could probably accomplish the same thing with any two units. There's something very special to me about sending up one group of HG Pioneer and watching them clear an entire forest by themselves while taking very minimal casualties. On top of this, the Valkyrie are just piles of more weapons, and while they're not nearly as good as any of the Big Light series infantry, they're still going to do an excellent job at that mid-ranged engagement. Finishing this out with the Panzer Grenadier with the MG42s, and this is just an excellent infantry tab in my opinion. In the tank tab, I bring in a Phase A card of the Panzer 4Gs, a Phase B card of the T-34 42s, a Phase B card of the Tiger Es, and a Phase C card of the Panzer 4Hs. Now, the Panzer 4Gs and Panzer 4Hs are practically the same vehicle in all respects that actually matter, and so I just brought in as many of those as I could. However, the Tigers are star-locked, as it were, to 2-star veterancy, and so bringing them in Phase B really lets you capitalize on them early enough to make them matter, however, not so early that you don't have any of them. I was for the longest time with this same division bringing them in Phase C to get the 4 per card, and I think that this is a perfectly viable way of looking at this division also. However, I dropped them down to Phase B as I found I was struggling in that phase to hold on to things that I had taken, and the Tigers really help with that. In the support tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the HGM G42, a Phase A Commandant, a Phase A card of the Sturm Tiger. I will get to why I bring in Phase A in the summation section of this review, a Phase B card of the Opel Blitz munitions, and a Phase B card of the Panzer IIIN. The Panzer IIINs are absolutely phenomenal. These things fire faster than they ever should, and while they've been slightly nerfed in that you can no longer hot swap them between Heat and HE very, very quickly, they're still excellent units to bring in. In the anti-tank tab, I lead it off with HG Panzerschreck, a Phase A card of Pak 38 50mm, which unfortunately come in the trashiest transport in the game, not even in the Opel Blitz, so that's kind of a downside to this division. However, I bring in a Phase B card of the Jagdpanzer IV and a Phase C card of the Jagdpanzer IV as well. In the AA tab, and let me begin by saying I understand that I could have brought in less than this. There were just so many 2-point slots and so many availability for the Flak 38 transports with the Flak 38 on them that I couldn't help myself. I brought in a Phase A card of the Flak 38 20mm, as well as a Phase B and C card in the same way, all of them at 1 star, all of them coming in the SDKFZ 10/4 transport with a Flak 38 mounted to the top. I do them at 1 star because I get a tremendous amount of them, and at 3 stars the Flak 38 almost shoots down a plane, so that's cool. I also brought in a Phase A, Phase B, and Phase C card of the 88 dual-purpose guns, and these guys were mainly my AT weapons, AA weapons, you name it, these guys did it. Bringing in these guys is like bringing in an entire army all at once. You can sacrifice an entire tick in Phases A, B, and C just to bring in one of these, and it will solve 98% of your problems. On top of that, you're building up toward that late game anti-air net that you're going to need to survive against some of the more spammy allied divisions. So when they come flying in and there are 12 Flak 88s and about a dozen Flak 38s on the field, those bombs aren't going off even a little bit. I will admit though that this anti-air tab is kind of a bit memey. If I was being intelligent, I would drop some of these cards, maybe bring in some of the motorized ones to supplement my current units, and maybe pick up some more recon or some more other tabs which are still just as good as this one. However, I found that no real tab lacked for anything in any of the games that I played throughout the week, and so I just didn't see a point in it. I really enjoyed having this much AA should the game go on long enough to bring it all in, and I don't know, that seemed fun enough to me. In the artillery tab, I let it off with a 105mm howitzer brought in the supply truck, a Phase C card of the battery Fuhrer, and a Phase C card of the 150s should I need to start counter-batterying late. In the air tab, I brought in a Phase A card of the Ju-87 cluster bombers, and a Phase B card of the Ju-87 anti-tank planes. I don't know if you can guess what I was using my air tab for mainly, but it rhymes with tanks if you're having trouble. I was just using these guys to kill enemy IS-2s that I didn't want to deal with in another way or help other fronts with their tanks that they were struggling to deal with. Moving on to the end of the week, and yeah, I finally did it. I dropped the Phase C card of the Flak 38s and brought in a card of the Fallschirmpanzer 3 in the Recon tab. The Fallschirmpanzer 3 is just going to be more usable for you in the long run, as well as the Flak 38s I wasn't able to bring in all of those Flak 38s, that's ridiculous, that was like 4,000 points of AA. I will always miss the Flak 38s though, and in one game I was able to bring in all of them, I'll have everybody know, and it was absolutely glorious watching them work. However, the Fallschirmpanzer 3 is obviously the better choice. Honorable mentions go out to the SPW-231, which I did bring in for a short time there, however, I just found that the Fallschirmpanzer 3 got me a little bit more towards killing heavier tanks or medium tanks that I ran into, and that's what I needed them for. Let me start with the burning question that I see a lot whenever I play this division. I bring in the Sturm Tiger in Phase A because I really like the Sturm Tiger and I want to be able to use it the entire game. This thing is absurdly good. It's as armored as a King Tiger, it has a 381mm cannon on the top, and it has a machine gun as though those things weren't enough. All this for 120 points at 1-star veterancy in Phase A, and that's absolutely ridiculous. The Sturm Tiger, for whatever reason, in the support tab of this deck, can be brought in at 1-star or no stars in Phase A without losing a single unit, obviously, because you could either bring in it in no stars in Phase A or at 1-star in Phase A, and that's a no-brainer decision. Sure, I maybe could have gotten more usability out of it by delaying it until Phase B, but honest to God, I think the 1 is plenty more than enough. You could honestly rename this division to things that support the Sturm Tiger and you wouldn't be wrong. The Sturm Tiger does literally all my heavy lifting when I play this deck. Stack of infantry, Sturm Tiger. Tank, Sturm Tiger. Any situation that presents itself that is not an aircraft, I Sturm Tiger it, and that's the entire game plan for this division. This thing will typically kill IS-2 1943s in 2 shots. Meanwhile, the IS-2 1943 literally cannot penetrate this thing at 2 kilometers. So it's absolutely brain dead that this thing is this good, however it is. One small downside, if you're new to the game you might not notice this or might not be ready to deal with it. The Sturm Tiger will never fire its main gun without being told to fire its main gun. What I mean by this is tanks in this game, or support units, will automatically fire with all the weapons they have available to them at units that they need to fire at. I know, excellent tutorial so far. However, what I mean by this is the Sturm Tiger will not do that with the 381mm cannon. It will angle its armor so that it is facing a tank that's sneaked up on it. However, it will just casually sit there as a Sherman shoots into it for the foreseeable future, and that'll be it. It'll just sit there until you tell it what to do. While I absolutely love this, as it has limited ammunition and I need every single one of those shots to count, as if it's reloading while I need it, I'm going to be absolutely pissed. It can be kind of a surprise to newer players in that it won't automatically use its weapon. Because of this, just using your fire on position command or just using your actual fire command by right-clicking on enemy units, that'll fix this problem and the gun will go off. Small other side note about the Sturm Tiger, it is a hull-locked vehicle, meaning that its cannon cannot swivel apart from the hull frame itself. What this means is, if you're engaging, say, a glob of infantry on your left and an IS-2 on the right, the Sturm Tiger will not fire at the glob of infantry on the left, no matter how many times you click on them. This is because it wants to angle its armor to face the IS-2, however, you're telling it to fire at something on its hard left, so it'll just sit there and cycle as though it's aiming forever and be shot by the IS-2. A lot of playing this division, honest to God, is just finding places for that Sturm Tiger to bear down on your problems and moving in with your floods of Ersatztrupp and Panzergrenadier and Valkyrie to capitalize on the situations created by it. On top of this, your tank tab is absolutely excellent. Panzer IVs and Tiger Es are just the best combination, and on top of that you have the spamminess that the T-34 provides to take a town or a forest. As if all of that weren't enough, your infantry are absolutely excellent, a lot of them coming in with multiple MG42s or MP44s. Your anti-air tab doesn't lack for anything. The 88s will stun planes as easily as they'll kill tanks, and your artillery tab still has the better of the Axis units in it that are available. A downside to this division is that it doesn't have any access to off-map artillery. However, I don't really need it all that much, so that's absolutely fine. In the anti-tank tab, you have the Jagdpanzer IVs to answer any of your problems that the Tigers or the Panzers are too busy otherwise to deal with, and the Jagdpanzer IV will just bounce shots from most enemy tanks all day long. What this all adds up to is that even though this deck relies heavily on the Sturm Tiger, if the Sturm Tiger is killed, you're not at a loss for things to do. Even without the Sturm Tiger, this deck is better than the first Polish infantry deck in every way, in my opinion. It has better AA, tanks, infantry, AT options, planes, so on, so forth, whatever you need. While it doesn't have any dedicated bombers, the Ju-87s are excellent at what they do, and I can't say the same for the IL-2Ms. They are good at what they do. If they drop their munitions, they're excellent at what they do. However, it's getting those munitions there and so on, and I don't know, the Ju-87 just typically does a better job of it because it'll actually drop its munitions or it'll fall back early and not die. Now I'm just getting off onto a tangent where I'm harping on the previous deck instead of talking about this one. The reality is that there's almost nothing negative I can say about this deck, and I'll admit that is a little bit due to bias of rose-tinted goggles that I have towards this division. I absolutely adore playing this division, I love playing against this division, I love everything about this division. Because of that love of this division, I've played this in everything from 1v1s all the way up to 4v4s, and I've honestly not struggled at all with this division. That isn't to say I haven't lost with this division, as obviously I have. However, I've never felt as though the loss was caused by me lacking for a unit that I would have otherwise had playing a different division. While I've done well with this division in 1v1s, I typically do my best work with this division in 4v4s or 3v3s, and that's because it has an excellent ability to support other fronts in an area that a lot of decks are oftentimes missing, and that's anti-aircraft weapons. Your ability to look at another front and notice that they don't have any AA and just dump down 2 Flak 88s or some Flak 38s and just solve all their problems with those, as well as provide additional dual-purpose support or whatever it is that they need at the time, is just huge. One of your allies is having trouble taking a forest, send some of your Sturm Pioneer, your HG Pioneer, or your Valkyrie to help them out. One of your allies is having trouble holding an open field, send them an 88 or a Tiger E. One of your allies is nearby you and having trouble with an IS-2, have the Sturm Tiger go blow that thing up. It's really just an excellent division for any single situation that I can think of. With all that said though, that is going to do it for this week in review. Thank you so much to Nikita for his suggestion of these two divisions, as I did actually have a ton of fun being able to play Hermann Goring again throughout this week. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, I hope you learned something.